everything for us.
Just try to be useful, When in doubt, make a positive difference. And luckily, it's some stuff that I read about, so I can finally share this with everybody.
All right. Well, we're going to talk about demand and if there's a bit of an allusion to the demand situation at this particular point. We already had a number of things that we've talked about here this morning. We've also got Michael Rudolph here with us as well. Michael, thanks for joining us. Happy New Year to you. As we look at the situation, I'm going to throw up there's a couple of charts here. Number one was the OTVI that you guys brought up at the very beginning of the program, where you saw, of course, the Tinder rejections not necessarily where they should be at this particular point. But you've also got, as John Kingston alluded to earlier today, higher transportation jobs, more capacity in the market, as your LMI charted released yesterday. So what's going on here? Because it looks like there's different and competing things, and Michael, we'll get to you and your thoughts with CPI and PPI here in a second, but what do you think? Is that demand really out there, or is this just an aberration that we're kind of blooming toward, waiting for the other shoe to drop, if you will?
Well, I would make an argument that there is more demand out there. We have seen coming out of the pandemic goods versus services. The split, there's typically, prior to the pandemic, there was a split, and we have seen it lean more towards some goods consumption, but the swap is what caused, the current freight recession, too much capacity. But it's such a weird situation because when we're asking about that demand, the consumer drives the U.S. economy, but at the same time, if you ask the consumer, they're super excited, but they say right now it's really rough, So it's this weird bipolarism almost with your American consumers, because what they're saying is, oh, the sky's falling, inflation is horrible, I can't believe this, I'm not making as much. But at the same time, credit card spending and everything else, their wallets are saying one thing while their hearts are saying another.
So, Michael, let's turn to you in this in terms of how things because we've talked about credit card debt and how that's affecting the economy. We're waiting for, of course, bills to be paid off there, if you will. But how do you see, is that demand really out there right now?
Right. There's a clear separation that we witnessed over the past year between consumer psychology and consumers' actual finances, what they have materially. And that kind of discrepancy is yet to manifest in any actionable sense. People are hoping, or some are hoping, I guess, that 2024 will be the time that consumers kind of come to their senses and realize what they have to work with. But I mean, honestly, I think the capacity of the American consumer to delude itself into purchasing more should never be underappreciated.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point there as well. So, Thomas, as you look at the situation in terms of what metrics we've seen, obviously we've brought up, Tinder rejections, we've seen jobs go up, we've seen credit card use go up without the bills necessarily being paid off at this return. What do you look at in terms of a metric, in terms of looking at that and saying, okay, there is demand out there, or there really isn't, or shouldn't maybe demand be out there?
Well, I mean, when we're looking at typical demand, it can be really easy to get caught up because you're going to look at spot rates and stuff, and you're going to assume because the market is low, spot rates are low, transportation capacity is plentiful, you're going to then try to make a conclusion saying, well, the consumer demand has fallen. Well, yes, it has, because the shift from goods, which was when we were shut down, to exclusively goods to services will cause a change in demand. I mean, that's just something that we were reverting back to. But at the same time, looking at things like outbound tender volumes, other indexes like your LMIs, your PPIs, and other things, you have to approach this from the side. So when I'm looking at contracted volumes, your freight volumes, freight of all kind being moved, it suggests to me that while demand has fallen from the highs of early 2023, we're coming out of it. Even 2022, we've seen lower demand. It's a situation where heading into 2024, it will still, I'm pretty bullish. I'm going to say it's going to be better, but at the same time, it's not going to look better because of abundant truckload capacity. So let's flip the frame real quick for 30 seconds and picture yourself as a shipper right now. They are going back to just in time. They are feeling confident enough that they don't have to carry excess inventory. And when they feel they need to adjust, they can quickly find capacity. That's one of the dogs that isn't barking when we're looking at the truckload, because as a trucking expert, my first thing to tell you is the sky is falling, the truckers are going out of business. But at the same time, if you're a consumer, Amazon's back to shipping my stuff stuff in 2 days. So nature is healing. So I'd say demand is there. Demand is always there. Consumers looking pretty good. The big thing to watch, though, is consumers, like the psychology Michael alluded on, when they run out of money, they stop abruptly. So we are in a situation where demand looks good, but we are smelling smoke, and we're going down the ski slopes, and these red flags, higher credit utilization, student loans. Student loans are one of the canaries in the coal mine that I think a large percentage haven't been paying since like October, and you get a year before it goes against your credit. So I think we've got a little bit more gas in the tank. By this time, by October of next year, when the student loan stuff starts hitting their credit reports, when they actually start getting some real impacts for not paying these, that may be the sign that the party's over and it's time to find a seat.
Michael, what do you look at in terms of the metric in that maybe indicates perhaps that there is real demand out there, or maybe that there isn't real demand out there, and we should be waiting, like Thomas said, for the other shoe to drop, whether that's student loans or something else?
So first of all, the number on the unpaid student loans, according to the Department of Education, is actually 40%. So that's high. It's higher than I think a lot of people would expect. So 40% of student loan borrowers have yet to pay. And, I think the time will come next October when it does start to impact the credit. I think one of the big things that we're going to be looking for is what the Fed does, obviously. There were a lot of hopes that they would begin cuts in March, hopes which I thought were frankly kind of unrealistic and unfounded. And they've started to kind of cool those expectations off. Some of the officials have come forward. We just had a red hot jobs report, and the truck transportation subsector did gain quite a fair number of jobs in December. That said, a lot of couriers and messengers, which includes FedEx and UPS, it lost, I think, 32,000 jobs in the month. Now, December is a month for job cuts traditionally, but I mean, looking at, and also some of that is offsetting the kind of trade deals they made with labor unions earlier in the year, but that, parcel delivery services can feel comfortable in letting go 32,000 jobs in a month means that maybe they don't expect consumer demand to be that persistent into the future, right? All your Amazon deliveries and things like that could be a worrying sign for consumer demand in the near future.
So, Thomas, as you look at this from a trucking carrier perspective, and you look at, okay, is there demand out there? Is there not demand out there? Does that weigh in on how you go forward here in terms of what you're looking at or what you're forecasting in terms of not only just what loads you're going to get, but also what personnel you need?
It's fascinating because there was an old Convoy study, RIP Convoy, pour one out for you, that talked about how a trucking or freight recession does not always predict a macro recession. You have about a 50-50 odds. So right now, here's the best part of the joke. We were talking about demand, and from a trucking expert standpoint, the market can improve by the middle to end of this year for carriers, and they could be making more money and doing better while the overall macro situation can deteriorate. Because when we're looking at the supply and demand of capacity to move things, you can have a situation where consumer consumption can start cratering, but transportation capacity has already bled off, and then the cycle will continue. So we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at this. It's important to remember it's a coin flip. We were trying to predict last year that there would be macro problems based on this ongoing freight recession. So far, the consumer has been oddly resilient. Schrodinger's consumer, we're both in a recession and not in a recession at the same time. We are seeing a situation where, the Fed is attempting to land the plane and do a softer landing. So when we're continuing to look at whether we're going to see rate cuts, if we start seeing rate cuts, and I think Michael will be able to talk to this better than me, then, looking at it from a trucking standpoint, maybe. Now, if we get into a depression from a trucking standpoint, then I'm going to say, okay, yeah, maybe we're going to have some problems. Trucking is normally a resilient role. I mean, you can survive some economic downturns unless you really screw something up. So that's one thing I'd watch is watch for the situation. And this is one of my predictions. I'm just going to throw it out there that if we do see an improvement in freight conditions, it will be because of the supply and demand, in spite of the fact that general economic conditions and this demand we're trying to figure out may be going downhill. That's what's fascinating about this industry, because we may have a boom cycle in the middle of a recession. You just don't know because the timing is not always a one-to-one.
Yeah. So, Michael, as you look at it, again, going to back to that point about soft landings and the Fed and how they're kind of trying to key into this as well. What do you think this means for the trucking industry as they look at it in terms of what they need to be doing to prepare for the next 6, 8, 10 months to get through 2024 and hopefully, like Thomas said, get to where that demand is actually still there, the capacity is bled off, and they get a chance to make some money?
I mean, I totally agree with Thomas 100%. I think something that we don't often discuss is that, truckers, your independent owner operators, are consumers too, right? So if things get tough for the consumers, they get tough for truckers. And that will kind of take capacity out of the market just naturally, right? This is one of those weird things, as Thomas was alluding to, right? The balance of supply and demand is the most important thing in determining spot rates moving forward. As carriers kind of bleed off the market, and Q1 is probably a prime stage to begin that exodus, then spot rates will normalize again. I think this contract bid season is probably the last kind of gasp of shippers' pricing power for at least a few years, and they'll drive their bargains, and we'll see how that shakes out come February. But after that, I don't expect contract rates to change outside of seasonality very much. So if you can make it through the next 3 months or so, just keep your overheads low, then I think you should be in a better position come Q2 and Q3.
Thomas, when you brought up the LMI chart in yesterday's on the spot, and of course, we mentioned capacity going up. Unfortunately or fortunately at that particular point, because again, we're still waiting for capacity to bleed off to get to this point. Is that perhaps a reaction to people saying, "Oh, it's getting better, I should get into the game now"? Or how do you see that working? And again, it's counterintuitive to what's going on with supply and demand in terms of rates and loads, but at the same time, people see that we're kind of getting through this, and a lot of economists and a lot of indicators say we're going to see some growth.
That's what's fascinating. We are seeing, even though we have a net loss of revocations, capacity is bleeding off. Capacity is still entering.
Yeah.
Because imagine you're trying to figure out when to jump. Do I jump at the bottom? It's like buying a house. Do I jump in when my rates are the lowest or when the top? Should I get in now?
It's that old adage about starting a business during a recession. That's a really good idea because you get more market share coming out of it as opposed to starting it when the economy is great, because then you're just competing against everybody who's doing very well.
That's the theory. Right now, the theory is if I want to jump in, I'm right at the corner and it's time to accelerate. So, I mean, one thing for truckload carriers that we will see, if Fed rates go down, it makes lending better. You get lower interest on your credit lines. You could probably get better deals buying your trucks, CapEx, and everything else. So, even we're going to see people come in because the barriers of entry is so low. But for the largest carriers that are on the contract 30,000 feet up, market movers, it's more of the same. Do your job well, save costs. Yep. And then you can figure everything else out.
One more quick, Michael, quickly, we've got about 30 seconds left here. What's the one indication you look at that's going to make people go one way or the other, whether or not they need to get in and buy and be bullish about this trucking market, or whether or not they need to exercise some caution?
In terms of a wave of capacity kind of entering the market, I think it will just happen when things start to get good. And of course, they will be struggling against the market share that they didn't accumulate when times were tough. Just based on what we've seen in previous cycles, capacity is still trickling in, and there are a few savvy individuals trying to navigate that. But I don't think we'll see any kind of major changes to the balance of supply and demand until things start to really heat up.
All right, it's going to be a very interesting next year because trying to figure out if this is an illusion or if it's the real thing. Thomas and Michael, thanks so much for joining us for our roundtable. All right.
Thank you.
We will take a short break and be back right after this.